11:30 a.m., July the 1st, 1999. There was no turning back. The pent-up water above the dam started flowing through the breach, first tentatively, then decisively.
On the morning of July 1st, 1999, more than 1,000 people crowd both banks of the Kennebec River in Augusta, Maine, and none of them came for a festival. They came to watch a single wall come down. A church bell rings, a backhoe swings into the earth, and the instant the first crack opens, a fish older than the dinosaurs comes hurling straight up out of the water.
There's just so many sturgeon in the river due to the river restoration and Clean Water Act, cleaning up the river here, that they're just pouring into different locations and utilizing different habitats, and that's why there's a whole bunch of them in the stream here.
What this crowd is about to witness is the one demolition that will drag one of America's greatest rivers back from the dead. And here's the part almost nobody believed until it actually happened. The wall falls. So, let me put you right there on the bank with them. It is early, the air still cool off the water, and the crowd stretches along both shores. Parents with kids on their shoulders, old-timers who remember exactly how bad this river used to smell, biologists who have staked their whole careers on what is about to happen. On the far bank, a yellow backhoe sits against a packed earthen wall. The church bell rings. The operator lowers the arm, bites into the earth, and for a few seconds, nothing. The wall holds. Then a thin trickle slips through the gap. Then the trickle becomes a torrent. And as the Kennebec breaks free for the first time in 62 years, the short-nosed sturgeon, a fish whose lineage reaches all the way back to the age of the dinosaurs, start leaping clear out of the surging current, throwing themselves into the morning light. Now, here is the question that should already be nagging at you. Why would the state of Maine spend years fighting to tear down a structure it had defended for more than a century? To understand that, you have to see what this river used to be. A river alive. Stand on this same bank in 1837, and you would not even recognize the water. Every spring, the Kennebec turns to silver as fish pour in from the Atlantic by the millions. This single river once hosted all 10 species of sea-run fish native to Maine, a full roster you simply do not find gathered in one place anymore. Atlantic salmon climb it, American shad, and several kinds of herring flood it. Short-nose and Atlantic sturgeon, some of them 10 feet long, roll through the deeper pools. And then there are the alewives. Picture a small, unassuming river herring, and then picture more than 6 million of them pushing upstream in a single season, because that is what the Kennebec carried at its peak. Those alewives were never just fish. They were the beating heart of an entire ecosystem that stretched from the mountains of Maine all the way out into the open ocean. Out at sea, they fed cod, striped bass, and bluefish. Along the banks, they fed eagles, otter, and great blue heron. Biologists call the alewife a keystone forage species because almost everything in the water and along the shore leans on it to survive. For thousands of years, a river thick with alewives was exactly what the Kennebec was. And that entire living world was about to be walled off. Not over decades, over a single building season. Building the barrier. The fight started before the first stone was even laid. In February of 1834, the people of the Kennebec Valley went to war over a proposal to dam their river. Petitions flooded the state legislature, some of them warning the project would bring the business of the whole county into bondage. What they were fighting over was, at the time, the largest dam project ever conceived in the United States, and the people who wanted it built one. In 1837, the Kennebec Dam Company finished its barrier across the river at Augusta, just below the head of tide, roughly 40 miles up from the Atlantic, 24 feet high, more than 900 feet across, a wall of timber and stone that cut the river clean in two. Its job was simple: power the mills, ease the boats, and turn a wild seasonal river into a steady industrial engine. They did include a fish ladder, a small gesture toward the salmon and shad that had climbed these waters since long before any Europeans set foot in Maine. On paper, the fish would still get through. In reality, that promise lasted less than a year. In the spring of 1838, a flood tore the fish ladder away, and the owners made the choice that would define this river for the next century and a half. They refused to rebuild it. Just like that, the door slammed shut on nearly a dozen migratory species that had climbed the Kennebec since the last ice age. 17 miles of rapids, riffles, and spawning gravel fell silent. Behind the wall, drowned under a flat, dead pond. But here is the detail almost everyone missed. That dam was never as permanent as it looked. It breached in a flood in 1839, again in 1846, a third time in 1855. And every single time, instead of letting the river take itself back, the owners patched the wall and rebuilt it. For 140 years, that was the pattern. The river pushing, the wall holding. Look, if stories like this are the reason you are here, do me one small favor and hit subscribe right now. The American Wild brings you the real, verified comebacks of this continent's rivers, forests, and wildlife every single week. And this is exactly the kind of story we live for. Because the Kennebec was finally about to get its shot. The math changes. But first, the river had to get worse. What grew behind that wall was not a lake. It was a wound. The water above Augusta turned warm, sluggish, and foul, a holding tank for mill waste and raw sewage pouring in from the towns along the banks. The stench got so bad that the workers inside the State House kept their windows shut through the hottest weeks of summer just to keep the smell out. Maine would eventually spend $100 million between 1972 and 1990 just to scrub the water back to modern standards. And then, slowly, the entire reason for the dam's existence evaporated. By the mid-1990s, the Edwards Dam was generating just 3.5 megawatts of electricity. That came out to 0.1% of Maine's entire power supply. 0.1%. A structure that had strangled a river for over a century, killed 17 miles of habitat, and locked out a dozen species of fish. And it was keeping the rough equivalent of a few neighborhoods lit. Then the rules changed. In 1986, federal law began requiring the agency that licenses hydropower dams to weigh the environmental damage a dam does against the value of the power it makes. For the first time, the harm counted. And when you put 3.5 megawatts on one side of the scale and a dead river on the other, the balance was not close. It won't work. There had already been one clear chance to fix all of this, and it got thrown away. In 1976, the dam breached yet again in a flood. Two members of the Natural Resources Council of Maine saw the opening and said the obvious thing out loud: leave it broken, let the river run free. Picture them at the edge of that gap, watching clean water move through for the first time in living memory, certain the moment had finally arrived. It was the right call more than 20 years early, and nobody with the power to act listened. The wall went back up, the pond came back, and the river waited another 23 years. When the push to finally remove the dam gained momentum, it ran straight into a wall of doubt that had nothing to do with engineering. The strongest argument against tearing it out was not about cost or floods or property lines. It was 4 words: it won't even work. Picture the skeptic, and trust me, there were plenty of them, arms crossed at the back of the public meeting, slowly shaking his head. The salmon have been gone 100 years. The shad, the sturgeon, all of it, a memory. What on earth makes you think they are coming back? And it was a fair question, which is what terrified the people pushing for removal, because they could not prove him wrong. Nobody had ever taken down a dam this large on a river this dead and watched what happened next. They were asking an entire state to bet millions of dollars on a hunch that nature, handed the chance, would heal itself. So they tried to load the dice. In the years before the wall even came down, fisheries crews were quietly seeding the river for a comeback. Between 1987 and 1999, the state trucked in and released nearly 644,000 adult alewives and more than 8 million American shad fry into the spawning grounds above the dam. They were building a coiled spring of fish, ready to explode upstream the instant the barrier disappeared. The hearing room. But the real battle never happened on the riverbank. It happened in hearing rooms, fluorescent lit and stacked with legal filings, far from the water everyone was fighting over. Picture that room. On one side sat the dam's owners and the whole weight of the hydropower industry, and they came in swinging. Federal regulators, they argued, had no authority, legal or moral, to force a private dam to come down. Rip it out, and you will erode the banks, trigger downstream floods, crater property values for everyone along the shore. It was reckless, they insisted, and far too expensive. And that argument had teeth because no federal agency had ever done what was about to be asked of it. Then, in November of 1997, FERC did something it had never done in its entire history. It refused to renew the dam's operating license, and it ordered the structure removed. Here is what that meant for the owners: take the dam down, or spend nearly $9 million to build a working fish ladder, plus another $1 million just to start repairing the damage the dam had already done. The numbers made the decision for them, and then one last piece slid into place. The shipbuilder, Bath Iron Works, agreed to pay $2.5 million toward the removal in exchange for permission to fill some wetlands downstream it needed for an expansion. Read that twice. Money from heavy industry, paying to bring a river back to life. In January of 1999, ownership of the Edwards Dam passed to the state of Maine for one reason and one reason only: to take it apart. After 162 years, the countdown had finally begun. The fish answer. There is a reason people still talk about that July morning, more than 2 decades later. As the Kennebec surged through the gap and the crowd erupted, the short-nosed sturgeon, sensing the sudden change in the current, hurled themselves out of the water, while the river came roaring back to life. And standing right there on the bank were 2 men who understood exactly what they were watching: Bruce Babbitt, the United States Interior Secretary, and Maine's Governor, Angus King. For King, this was the Kennebec reclaiming its place as both an economic asset and an ecological wonder. For Babbitt, watching the water pour through, it was the beginning of an entirely new chapter in how America treats its rivers. Neither of them yet grasped just how completely the river was about to prove them right. Because the dam was gone, and 17 miles of river ran free for the first time since before the Civil War, and the recovery did not wait for a decade or a new generation. It started almost the instant the water broke through. The fish suddenly had open access to 18 more miles of habitat, all the way up to where the Sebasticook meets the Kennebec. Atlantic sturgeon began moving past the old dam site within weeks, alewives and shad pressing in right behind them. The skeptics had asked whether the fish would ever come back. The fish answered before the dust had even settled. They had been waiting at the base of that wall, generation after generation, for someone to open the door. The web rebuilds. Once a river is handed back its free-flowing self, researchers will tell you the recovery can begin in moments, not months. But even the people who study this for a living were not ready for what the Kennebec did next. Here is the moment that still gives me chills. Within a single year, observers spotted seals, ocean seals, 40 miles inland from the Atlantic, hauling up a river that had been a biological dead zone just months earlier, chasing schools of alewives. Stop and picture that. A harbor seal swimming 40 miles up a New England river because the food had finally come home. And the seals were only the front of the wave. The alewives were the trigger for everything else, because as the herring flooded back in, every animal that leans on them came surging back too. River otter returned. So did mink, bald eagles, osprey, and great blue heron, all following the fish upstream toward the feast. Along one 5-mile stretch of the Sebasticook, the wildlife biologists who walked it counted as many as 58 bald eagles in a single day. Imagine being the person keeping that tally. You get to 20, then 30, then 40, and the eagles keep coming, every one of them drawn by the same explosion of returning fish, on a river that a few years before had been a sewage-choked pond. More than 3 million alewives now push up the Sebasticook every single year, a run so dense it can blacken the shallows. A few seasons later, a quieter signal showed up, one that mattered even more than the eagles. The insects came back. Mayflies and stoneflies, fragile creatures that survive only in clean, cold, oxygen-rich water, returned to the Kennebec in force. That is the tell. The river was not just carrying fish through it again. It had gotten healthy enough at its very foundation to rebuild itself from the bottom of the food chain up. Anglers from the local Trout Unlimited chapter were already pulling shad and striped bass out of it the very next year, and people came home too, drawn by a river so thick with alewives that in places you could not see the bottom, where a 10-foot Atlantic sturgeon, once an almost mythical sight, might now break the surface right in downtown Augusta. The numbers. The people who study these rivers thought they understood the scale of what was possible. They were wrong. In 1999, the year of the breach, roughly 78,000 alewives came back to the Kennebec to spawn. Within a couple of decades, that run had climbed past 5.5 million. And in 2025, more than 9 million river herring pushed up the river in a single season. That is not a typo. 78,000 fish to more than 9 million. The same recovery is now playing out on the neighboring Penobscot, where dam removals have driven the river herring count from a few thousand to nearly 7 million. The Kennebec system now hosts the largest run of its kind anywhere in North America. Beyond Edwards. And here is why Edwards mattered far beyond one small city in Maine. What happened on the Kennebec refused to stay a local story. It became the spark for a national movement. 9 years after Edwards came down, the Fort Halifax Dam upstream finally came out too, after a brutal 5-year court fight, opening still more of the Sebasticook for the returning herring. On the neighboring Penobscot, the Great Works and Vesey dams fell in 2012 and 2013. Across those projects, restoration reopened well over 1,000 miles of habitat to fish that had been shut out for the better part of 2 centuries. And each removal was easier to argue for than the last, because each one had Edwards standing behind it as proof. Now zoom out, because the scale of what is still possible is staggering. The United States is blanketed with more than 500,000 dams. Thousands of them past 60 years old and sitting in poor condition, quietly aging toward failure, and the country has started pulling them down at a pace that would have been unthinkable in 1999. In both 2019 and 2024, a record 108 dams came out in a single year, freeing rivers in more than 24 states at once. And this is the part that seals it. Since 1999, well over 1,000 dams have been torn out across the country, many of them directly inspired by what one small dam in Maine proved was possible. To this day, the Edwards removal remains the only time federal regulators have ever forced a hydropower dam down against its owner's will. It set the legal precedent that made every removal after it thinkable. And the work is not finished. In 2025, the Nature Conservancy and a renewable power company announced a deal to remove 4 more dams on the lower Kennebec, reopening hundreds more miles of river for the Atlantic salmon still clinging to survival in these waters. What they tore down. Come back one last time to that church bell on the 1st of July, 1999, and the sturgeon leaping into the morning light. What the people on that bank really tore down was never just a wall of timber and stone. They tore down an idea. The idea that a structure, once built, has to stand forever. The idea that a river, once silenced, can never sing again. The Kennebec proved both of those wrong, and it did it in less than a single year. Today the water runs clear past the windows of that same state house, windows that do not have to stay shut against the smell anymore. And on a good spring morning, you can stand in Augusta and watch a 10-foot Atlantic sturgeon break the surface in the exact spot where a dam stood for 162 years. The river remembered exactly what it was. It had only ever been waiting for someone to get out of its way. If you want to see more rivers, more forests, more wild places pulled back from the edge like this one, subscribe to the American Wild and stay right here with us, because this is what we do every single week. And before you go, tell me down in the comments, which river near you deserves a second chance like the Kennebec got?